2 weeks ago, we talked about the perceived conflict of the believer understanding their inheritance in Christ Jesus. In today's episode, we will take a step forward by looking into how to possess our inheritance. That is coming up next. Hi everyone, my name is Nashi Uhuru. Welcome to the Uhuru Reports, where we share principles about life and godliness in the simplicity of the good news. Let me recapitulate the 7 truths about God's provision we talked about in part 1 of this series. We stated that first, God's provision is in abundance. Secondly, the provisions come only through our knowledge of God and Jesus. Thirdly, that God's power has already given us everything we need. Fourth, it is all contained in knowing and acknowledging Jesus. Fifth, and this is the key to understanding everything, that the provision is in the promises. Sixth, by appropriating the promise, we participate in the divine nature of God Himself. And 7, in proportion as we do this, we escape the corruption in the world through evil desire, because the nature of God and corruption are incompatible. Now, after understanding the principles of your inheritance and where they are at, how do you step up and possess them? First and foremost, we have to understand that every given covenant and promises by God in the Bible or by prophecy leaves the beneficiary with a responsibility. What do I mean by that? When a beneficiary inherits assets, they are responsible to manage those assets properly. There may be details, instructions in the will that direct the management of the inherited assets. Such arrangement must be respected and followed by the beneficiaries. The actual step we take to enter into our inheritance is found in the Old Testament book of Joshua, which describes how God's people, the Israelites, entered into the land God had promised to them. Understand that Joshua provides a pattern that we too can follow if we must experience our inheritance. Beginning with the first 3 verses of Joshua chapter 1, it says, "Now it came about after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, that the Lord spoke to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' servant, saying, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now, therefore, arise across this Jordan, you and all the people, to the land which I am giving to them, to the sons of Israel. Every place on which the sole of your feet treads, I have given it to you, just as I spoke to Moses." Joshua chapter 1, verse 1 through 3. Notice the tenses God uses in these scriptures. In verse 2, He uses the present tense, I am giving. But in verse 3, He uses the perfect tense, I have given them the land. The lesson is this: once God says, I give it to you, as far as God is concerned, from then on it has been given. The second point is, God required all the people to cross over into the land He was giving them. I believe for the people of God, there is something similar ahead when all believers will be enabled to come into our full inheritance. From the point of God's promises onward, Israel had the legal right given them by God to the entire land, but they still did not have experiential possession of the land. I want you to see this vital principle. There is a difference between the legal right and the experiential possession of what God has promised us as our inheritance. The actual process by which Israel moved into the land began with their first two successes, which came through miracles. A miracle opened the way for them to cross the Jordan, and through a miracle, they captured the first city, Jericho. After that, they had to fight for all the rest. Because God said, every place on which the sole of your foot tread, I have given it to you. Verse 3. The only way they gained experiential possession was by actually placing their foot on the ground they were claiming. This closely parallels what happened as we gain our inheritance. In the Old Testament, under a leader named Joshua, God led his people into a promised land. In the New Testament, under a leader named Jesus Christ, which by the way is the same name as Joshua, God led his people into the land of promises. When we are born again and legally become God's children, from then on we are heirs to all that God has. This is what Paul says in Romans chapter 8 verse 16 and 17. The Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, heirs also, heirs of God, and fellow heirs with Christ. If indeed we suffer with him, so that we may also be glorified with him. So we are heirs to the whole inheritance, heirs to all the blessing, but also heirs to the sufferings. We cannot skip the suffering and expect to inherit the blessings. The condition is if we suffer with him. What must we do then? To gain experiential possession of our inheritance as Christians, we need to apply the lessons of Joshua. I would suggest the following as the main principle. First, God will do miracle, but God will not do miracle when they are not necessary. Secondly, like Israel, we will have to fight for most of our inheritance. We will not enter into our inheritance unless we are prepared to take on the opposing powers of darkness and defeat them. Thirdly, we have to set our foot on what God has promised us and take possession of it individually and personally. When we do that, we will find that we inevitably share in Christ's suffering. Essentially, there are two actions we need to take. First, we must be prepared to fight. And secondly, we need to set our foot on what we claim as our inheritance. In other words, fight. Set your foot.